Welcome to this October 2021 Acting for Justice presentation. My name is Jack Jezreel. I serve on the staff of JustFaith, and I'm delighted that you could join us tonight. One of the challenges of faith is to embrace both the joys and the sorrows of the human community. We celebrate the joys together and we share in the sorrows together, and we're compelled to respond. And if there is a sorrow that has permeated all of life in the United States in 2021, it's the sadness of not being able to talk to each other across any kind of difference. Many, most, maybe all of us on this call tonight have known the profound loss of conversation with colleagues or friends, or maybe even family members because of the assumption of political rhetoric. If you don't agree with me, you are my enemy. It has created divides almost as vast as COVID. And the combination of demonizing on top of a pandemic has created chasms beyond our imagining. We are a divided people. We are a wounded people. And tonight we're going to tackle that fact. Again, welcome to tonight's gathering. I'd like to begin, as we always do, with prayer. Our prayer this evening is entitled, A Prayer for the Gift of Tongues. Let us pray. God of revelation, throughout history, you have shown yourself to your people. In a century by century, year by year, day by day process, we have learned how to see your light, to hear your voice, to notice your presence. You have communicated your grace in ways that we might understand. Your word, your self-giving, your invitation have guided our steps. Loving, giving God, these days we find ourselves peculiarly unable to hear each other. We speak to each other without listening, without caring to listen. We shout, not to be heard, but to subdue. We speak words not to share, not to connect, not to support, but to bully, mandate, order, attack, and hurt. We seem to have lost our way. And disabled by our miscommunication and our missing communication, we're staggered by friends and family who we can no longer talk with or be with. We feel estranged and alienated by a wall so tall and wide, it is hard to know how to get beyond it. So gracious God, be with us, guide us, equip us for the task of this day. These times seem like no other, but what is the same is your presence, communicating love and love's beckon. So we ask not to be deterred, even as we are unsure about what to do. We aspire to love the stranger and the enemy with our actions and our words. We will seek understanding, even as it might be elusive. And we do these things because the love you have revealed to us guides our hearts and our steps and our tongues, and we give thanks. Amen. And now it's my pleasure to introduce you to our presenter tonight, Jill Rauh. Jill is the Director of Education and Outreach in the Office of Justice, Peace, and Human Development of the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops, which, as I said before, is the longest job title in the history of human speech. She holds a BA from Marquette, a Master of Arts in Theology from Washington Theological Union, and a Master of Arts in International Affairs from George Washington University. Before joining the USCCB in 2007, Jill served as Senior Program Associate of the Education for Justice Project at the Center of Concern, worked in civic engagement with Latino youth, helped lead parish and campus ministry efforts, and served as an international volunteer with Rostro de Cristo in Ecuador. Jill was our very first Acting for Justice speaker in March of 2020, and we're delighted to have her back for a third time. As always, Jill, it's nice to have you.
Thank you so much, Jack, and hello, everyone. I'm so happy to be back with you. I always enjoy being with the Just Faith family as a Just Faith graduate myself many years ago. And I've been particularly delighted that the Bishop's Subcommittee for the Catholic Campaign for Human Development has been actively promoting participation in Just Faith's specifically Catholic programs. So thank you for all that you do. I'm just so delighted to be here with you. So I know the timing of my presence with you is no accident, since Just Faith's program that you just heard about it was launched this week. I was so excited to hear about the launch of that program. I haven't seen it yet, but I think it sounds very consistent with some of the work that we've been trying to do at the conference to encourage civil dialogue, to encourage encounter, conversation, and listening. So that is the topic that we are going to be discussing today. And with that, I've shared my screen with you. So as you may note, the initiative that I have been working with around a better kind of politics is based on Pope Francis's call in Fratelli Tutti, his most recent encyclical, to seek encounter and to see ourselves as members of the same human family, finding a better way to do politics, one that unites and one that truly seeks the common good. And key central to this approach is that concept of encounter, how we encounter one another. And for Pope Francis, if you've read Fratelli Tutti, you know that Jesus's parable of the Good Samaritan is the model that he encourages us to imitate. So the Good Samaritan, he writes, by approaching and making himself present, the Good Samaritan crosses cultural and historic barriers. The go and do likewise of that story is about putting aside our differences and drawing near to others with no questions asked, Pope Francis says. It's a little different understanding of the Good Samaritan than we sometimes hear about. Furthermore, Pope Francis points out that love does not care where a brother or sister is from. For love shatters the chains that keep us isolated and separate. In their place, it builds bridges. Love enables us to be one great family. I think, at least for myself, I often see this parable of the Good Samaritan about helping those in need. And it is about that. But for Pope Francis, it's about more than that. It has a wider application. He's challenging us in bringing this parable up repeatedly in the encyclical to really see all people as members of the human family. That's a really challenging thing. And I don't have the answers for you in this presentation, but I promise I am going to give you some challenging things to think about and some things to take to prayer. And so, speaking of prayer, I know that we began our time together with a short prayer. I want to go a little deeper with that. I want to ask you to join me in actually prayerfully entering in to the parable of the Good Samaritan together, because that's where we have to begin as people of faith. We come with our disappointment, our disillusionment, the relationships that have been broken or lost, as Jack asked us about and to discuss in our small groups in the beginning. And those things all affect us. They affect our ability to actually move forward in the model of the Good Samaritan. And so we come to God in prayer and we ask for God's help, God's assistance to open our hearts and to help us hear the message that can challenge us and help us to move forward. So I want to invite you just for a few minutes to walk with me in a prayer exercise that is going to use imaginative prayer with scripture. The goal is that we might know Jesus and his teachings a little bit better through this imaginative interaction. I come from an Ignatian tradition, if you all can't tell. So are you ready? I want you to begin by finding a comfortable position wherever you are. If you feel comfortable, closing your eyes and starting by breathing deeply in and out, centering yourself. I'm going to allow a few moments of silence for you to breathe and to invite Christ to accompany you in this prayer together. And I will begin by reading slowly the parable of the Good Samaritan from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10. Jesus is responding to the question, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man fell victim to robbers as he went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. They stripped and beat him and went off, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down that road, but when he saw him, he passed by on the opposite side. Likewise, a Levite came to the place, and when he saw him, he passed by on the opposite side. But a Samaritan traveler who came upon him was moved with compassion at the sight. He approached the victim, poured oil and wine over his wounds, and bandaged them. And then he lifted him up on his own animal, took him to an inn, and cared for him. The next day, he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper with the instruction, 'Take care of him. If you spend more than what I have given you, I shall repay you on my way back.' Which of these 3, in your opinion, was neighbor to the robber's victim?" He answered, "The one who treated him with mercy." And Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." In a moment, I'm going to read the passage a second time. And this time, we're going to attempt to live into the passage, using your senses and your imagination as much as possible. Choose to become, in your mind's eye, one of the 3 characters in the story: the priest, the Levite, or the Samaritan. And as you hear the story again, I want you to imagine the face of the victim on the side of the road. And I invite you to make that face one of the relationships that you've lost, that you just reflected on a moment ago. In preparation to begin the story, we imagine the setting: the dry land, the rocky path. What do you see? Can you feel a breeze? Can you smell the dusty air? In your own character that you have chosen, what do you look like? How are you dressed? Is it hot? Are you sweating under the scorching sun? Where are you headed as you walk down the path? How do you feel when you see the beaten man? What does he look like? Whom does he look like? What kind of shape is he in? And what is your reaction to seeing him? Is your natural reaction a sense of dread? What excuses do you make up not to stop and help? Are you running late? Might he be someone outside your group, or someone you don't want to talk to? Why don't you help him? Now we enter into the passage again with these reflections in mind. A man fell victim to robbers as he went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. They stripped and beat him and went off, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down that road, but when he saw him, he passed by on the opposite side. Likewise, a Levite came to the place, and when he saw him, he passed by on the opposite side. But a Samaritan traveler who came upon him was moved with compassion at the sight. He approached the victim, poured oil and wine over his wounds, and bandaged them. Then he lifted him up on his own animal, took him to an inn, and cared for him. The next day, he took out 2 pieces of silver and gave them to the innkeeper with the instruction, "Take care of him. If you spend more than what I have given you, I shall repay you on my way back." Which of these 3, in your opinion, was neighbor to the robber's victim? He answered, "The one who treated him with mercy." Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." As we continue in our prayer, breathing deeply, experiencing the story, we wonder, what does it mean to practice mercy? We recall again Pope Francis's words, "Love shatters the chains that keep us isolated and separate. In their place, it builds bridges. Love enables us to create one great family." As a final part of this prayer time, what of your character's experience is relevant to your own, to your approach or your perspectives about those you see as other, those outside my group, those who think differently from me? What prevents me from the act of encounter? What keeps me from love that shatters chains? For the purposes of time, we will come out of this story now. But you can continue the story in your heart and in your imagination, in your own later prayer time if you wish. When you do, let the Holy Spirit guide you. Return to the story in your character and your prayer and see how God continues to speak to you. For now, we consider, is it really only with this deep reflection on the parable of the Good Samaritan that we can begin to understand the topic of today's session? This call to love, this call to encounter, this vision for a better kind of politics. And so going back, if you were participating in the Fratelli Tutti presentation that I joined you for a few months ago, you may remember this picture of dark clouds. Pope Francis opens his encyclical by naming some of the dark clouds over a closed world. He explains what he terms a throwaway world that's characterized by indifference toward the human person. He talks about the virus of individualism that threatens to further break down our connection to one another. And he says that our current reality has given free rein to ideologies that can be destructive. And he names hyperbole, extremism, and polarization as having become political tools that drive further disunity between us. And with all of this in mind, I think the inclination can often be to disengage completely from the political space. And yet we all know that we are called to participate, that we must engage in the public square, that we must be faithful citizens, and that we must not imitate the priest and the Levite, that we are called to stop, to encounter, to practice mercy, to engage, even when it's uncomfortable, and even when the other is someone that I see as completely unlike me, outside my group, my faith tradition, my political party, or fill in the blank of whatever other group you may have. So how do we practice this mercy? How do we practice it by remaining true to our values, as Jack was mentioning earlier? I'm going to draw specifically a few points, 5 points from Pope Francis, especially chapters 5 and 6 from Fratelli Tutti, if you are planning to read further into that encyclical, as well as the book Let Us Dream. Part 2 in particular has some wonderful content on this call to engage. And so the first main point that I want to share from Pope Francis is that he says that we have to recover the sense of belonging to a single human family. We have to see that we are all in the same boat. This has to be our disposition as we encounter others, as we try and enter into encounter and dialogue. We have to make the decision to see each other first as human beings and as children of God. Every other person is someone who God loves. And so for Pope Francis, he says that isolation and withdrawal into our own interests is never the way to restore hope and bring about renewal. He says we do not develop as people by withdrawing from others. Instead of the inclination to be concerned only with myself or my group or my own interests, we have to commit to overcoming our individualistic mindsets and instead seek the good of all people, including those that we may see as different from us. Again, the Samaritan and the victim from completely different groups, and yet connecting as humans and as children of God. So that's point number 1 that he makes. We have to recover that sense of belonging to our human family. Second, he talks about relationship and encounter. We have to engage in encounter that fosters relationship. I was reflecting in my small group before coming back that I think that sometimes, because it's easiest when we're around people that only agree with us, we can self-select who we want to interact with and where we want to be. And that is really too bad, because it prevents us from having encounter where we can see others as more than their opinion about one thing, but as the fullness of people who have many gifts to bring into relationship. In the language of Pope Francis and Fratelli Tutti, these authentic encounters are a means of cultivating social friendship, because it is only in relationship with one another, in charity or love, social love, that we can find new ways of approaching the problems of today's world. Practically, this means being willing to encounter, to be in relationship, holding ourselves to Christian standards in imitation of Jesus's love and charity as we encounter, always remembering, for example, that the other person is a child of God, presuming that they have good intentions rather than assuming the worst about someone else's motives, encountering in order to listen and understand instead of just trying to win an argument. Unfortunately, in the political space, we have become accustomed to efforts that Pope Francis says are aimed more to discredit and insult our opponents from the outset, rather than to open a respectful dialogue aimed at achieving agreement on a deeper level. And so this is a situation in which we must be prophetic, modeling by example a respectful approach that honors others as made in God's image. I'm going to give an example from my own life that's not related to politics, because I think sometimes we automatically assume that this only applies to the political sphere. This is something interpersonal, and I think it is just telling of how what the opportunities are here if we embrace this approach. So during the pandemic, I have an 8-year-old. He's too young to be vaccinated. Hopefully he will be soon. But we were trying to brainstorm how we can give back, how we can help so many people who are in need. We have a food pantry at our parish. We wanted to do something more. didn't feel comfortable taking him to volunteer with him being unvaccinated. So he said, Mom, we garden a lot. Let's have a plant sale. We can propagate a lot of plants. And he actually used the word propagate because he's a little gardener. We can put them in pots and we can put them on the sidewalk and have a sidewalk sale. I'll use my race car to collect people's money so I can social distance. Right. So we put up some signs, we advertise. Well, the day before the sale, I get a knock on the door, and it's one of my neighbors, someone I've actually never met before, lives a couple blocks away. And he said, hi, I heard you're having this sale. I just wanted to tell you how great I think that is. It's really wonderful that you're doing that. Do you know that one of the plants that you're selling, some people see it as invasive. And you have a lot of native plants that you're selling, but this one, were you aware that it grows really quickly? Maybe you shouldn't be selling it. We had a wonderful conversation for a half an hour, standing at the door, connecting on our common values and beliefs and helping others and having this plant sale. He informed me, he shared his perspective about this particular plant, which was new to me, and I didn't know this information. And then he said, I just want to really affirm what you're doing. I would offer, I have some native plants in my yard. If you'd be willing to not sell this one, I'll replace them with something from my yard. I said, great, that's perfect. I am more than happy to oblige, right? But why do I bring this example up? Because he was willing to encounter. His default was not to walk past and shake his head and say, oh, I wish she wasn't going to sell that at her plant sale. Or worse yet, put it on the listserv. I'm not supporting this plant sale because they're selling this plant that I don't like. Or write a nasty note and leave it in my mailbox, right? All the different things that he could have done. And yet he came to my door. He connected with me as a human person. He didn't accuse me. He asked questions. Were you aware? I wanted to share this information. He affirmed the positive things I was doing, and we were able to come to a resolution. It's not always that easy, of course, in all situations, but I think that it's a good example of why that default of assuming that someone else has good intentions and defaulting to encounter can be a very good thing. Also, it's a good segue because the next and third point of the 5 that I am sharing with you from Pope Francis is the importance of starting by identifying common values. He says that we have to identify common values based on truth. Social love, he says, has to be accompanied by a commitment to truth, informed by both faith and reason. And so a few points here. One, it helps when we approach dialogue, knowing what we believe, knowing what our values are, having a properly formed conscience and understanding our tradition and the values that inform our perspectives. But after we know that, we understand and can articulate the values that we have, an essential starting place for dialogue is to identify the common values rooted in truth and justice, such as the dignity of the human person, or protecting the environment, or a commitment to the poor. These were 2 values I connected on with my neighbor. Fundamental human rights, integral human development, supporting families, right? These are ways that we can step back from the issue that we may be having a conflict on and try to say, okay, well, where do we have some commonality? I have a different perspective than some people in my extended family about immigration. And so can I have a conversation with them where we can, however, connect on some common value? Maybe it's about protecting families, allowing families to thrive, and then we can talk about our different approaches to that issue and come to some understanding of one another that we didn't have before. It's a starting point. Number 4 is that we have to learn how to unmask the various ways that truth, Pope Francis says, has been manipulated, distorted, and concealed in public and private discourse. Part of that is unmasking media sources that are actually powerful special interests that seek to tilt public opinion unfairly in their favor, Pope Francis says. And so an important starting point in preparing for dialogue is to consider what sources I get my information from. Are these sources reputable and longstanding? Are they neutral news sources, or maybe connected with a particular political party or bias? Is it possible that I or others might be being manipulated in some way by persons or groups that have their own interests in mind? How can I check claims that I hear against multiple sources to ensure their accuracy before I share information with others? As we're thinking about dialogue, if you have people coming together for dialogue, I think this looking at sources of where we get our information and agreeing on some common sources to use to inform that can be really, really helpful. Number 5, and this is the last point that I'll share from Pope Francis, is that we must get comfortable with the polyhedron, with being a polyhedron. What do I mean by that? Well, if you forgot your high school geometry, a polyhedron is a 3-dimensional shape that has many faces. And a polyhedron, as Pope Francis is using it, represents a society where differences coexist, complementing, enriching, and reciprocally illuminating one another, even amidst disagreement and reservations. And he writes that authentic social dialogue involves the ability to respect the other's point of view and to admit that it may include legitimate convictions and concerns, and that others have a contribution to make, and that we can both be frank and open about our beliefs while also continuing to discuss and seek points of contact, and above all, to work and struggle together. And in his book, Let Us Dream, Pope Francis writes that polarization results when we erroneously perceive disagreement as contradiction instead of contraposition. What does he mean by that? With contradiction, we create separate camps where there's one winner and one loser. But with contraposition, differences can coexist, but they're capable of interacting in a fruitful, creative tension. And so we have to be willing to dialogue with an open heart and get comfortable with creative tension as we hold simultaneous points of view that don't always fit neatly together, but which can yield solutions that are focused on the common good. And so, what does that look like when we put those into practice? And sorry, before I do that, I actually just want to make a couple of caveats because I think they're really important. So first of all, how does this all relate to social media? Because, we talk about dialogue, and then there's this whole other sphere of social media that can be a really challenging one. Pope Francis has often called out social media for its role in contributing to misinformation, hate, anger, etc. I think he was just talking about that this week again. But at the same time, he reminds us that social media can be a positive tool for evangelization if it's used well. And he does that quite expertly. Just a few days ago, he had that tweet storm that was supporting economic policies that prioritize the poor. So I think these reflections, they shouldn't cause us to reject social media, but to maybe think more critically about how we use it and also its limitations. For example, can true encounter really happen through social media? I'm not sure that it can, but we can be intentional about sharing well-researched content. We can also engage knowing that it's a person on the other side of the interactions that we have. We can invite and model civil interactions that always are person-focused. And we can post content that shares stories and experiences that can help open up a conversation that is really focused on the dignity of the human person. And then another sort of just challenging point, and maybe point for further conversation, is engagement always the default? You may be kind of listening and saying you're idealizing, encounter and relationship. It's not always healthy to do that. And that's true. And I want to acknowledge that. On the one hand, encounter and relationship is transformative. We can learn from the model of the Good Samaritan. It's essential to healing our human family. And so our default should be towards engagement, towards the Good Samaritan inspired connecting with others. But at the same time, in order to have a productive conversation, a productive encounter that leads to true dialogue, you do have to have two parties that are interested in that are interested in listening to understand, identifying common values, looking at common solutions. And it's not dialogue if only one party is interested in finding solutions, but the other party is only interested in winning the argument. So I think this can be best applied when you do have individuals who want to come together and want to try to have a relationship despite differences. Also, I think it's important to note that there can sometimes be power differences, historical and present day, that may need to be taken into account when you're thinking about dialogue, or if you're thinking about arranging one with the community that you work with. For example, if your community was organizing a dialogue on racism, you'd probably do well to have a privileged space for sharing stories and experiences of those who have been victims of racism, who have not historically been allowed to tell their stories, not just to have everybody sit around the table as equals and share their opinions on racism. It's important to take into account those power dynamics and also the kind of historical ways that people's experiences have not always been able to be shared. And then finally, for further reflection, I think there's a special responsibility to listen at the margins. In the prefatory document for the synod process that is just starting and is going to be happening in the country, Pope Francis asks, when we say our church, who's part of it? Who are our road companions, including those outside our perimeters? What persons or groups are left on the margins, expressly or in fact? So I think that making sure that conversations are involving people who are often impacted by the issues we may be talking about is just really, really important. Okay, so final slides before I turn it back over to our organizers. So who is contributing to a better kind of politics? I want to just give you a few examples of this in practice. I've been really impressed over the years with a parish in the Twin Cities in Minnesota, St. Olaf. There's a group there that has been organizing for years something called Discussions That Encounter, and it focuses in particular on racism and bringing people together from different faith traditions, different ethnic backgrounds, who can all come together and talk about this. They listen to a speaker, and then they have really difficult conversations that have also led to understanding and opportunities to take action. So really, really fantastic. The Archdiocese of Washington, they are launching a civil dialogue training forum. They're having diocesan teams working with a nonprofit organization that does dialogue for their focus, training adult facilitators, and then leading conversations with youth, both in the Archdiocese, and they're partnering with other dioceses to also do it where they are. And they're focusing on dialogues on human life and dignity, anti-racism, and Catholic perspectives on immigration. And then the youth leaders bring their experiences back to their own communities and demonstrate these values to their peers. So again, really exciting work. And then finally, if you're looking to really try and implement a better kind of politics in your community, the website where USCCB's initiative is located is civilizeit.org. There are some great resources: examination of conscience, reflections for bulletins. There's a pledge where you can pledge to charity, clarity, and civility, kind of reflecting some of the points that I have made in this presentation. And also just some really wonderful prayer and reflection resources. So I hope that can be useful to you. I hope I've given you a few things to think about. And if we have time, I am happy to answer a few questions.
Thanks, Jill. Folks, feel free to reply to my note and with any questions you might have. Jill, just a couple of things I was thinking of. many, many years ago, and in fact, it was a book that we used to use in the original Just Faith program 20 years ago, was a book that was co-written by Henry Nouwen, George Morrison, and somebody else. Three. It happened to be three clergy persons, and the title of the book was just called Compassion. And one of the chapters was called Voluntary Displacement. In other words, the choice to put myself in a place where I can have an encounter with somebody I might not otherwise have an encounter with. I'm also thinking of some of the prescriptions that we've heard over the last several years about white people putting themselves in black spaces just so that we can have a conversation in a way that wouldn't necessarily happen otherwise. And it seems to me like these are themes that are being repeated in Pope Francis's words, and sort of saying it straightforwardly, like putting myself in a different place where I can have a conversation, is both simply put, but also a pretty challenging invitation. Do you want to say anything more about that?
Yeah, and I remember that book. I read that as part of my own Just Faith journey when I was in a Just Faith program. It is a really beautiful chapter and concept as well. Yeah, I mean, I think that for Pope Francis, like, encounter is transformative, right? We come outside of ourselves and we see from another person's perspective as we truly try to listen and understand. And there's something that happens, you know, in our hearts and in their heart too. And so we may think that somebody is just completely different from us and there's no way that we can connect and there's nothing we have in common. But when we put ourselves in that place of encounter, we often find that we're wrong about that.
Yeah, somebody wrote on the chat, they were mentioning Greg Boyle, right? And he's really made a career out of speaking the truth of gangs living in LA and what the story is that, I'm sorry, am I breaking up?
You're fine to me.
Okay, good. But basically, he's made a career out of telling the story of what really is an under or unreported reality of men and women who are in gangs and able to speak in a voice that no one's ever heard before, exactly because he's had this extended encounter with a community that most of us aren't willing to, cross the, invisible wall in order to get to, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very true. And I think it's, experiences like Father Greg Boyle, that we read about, that through that storytelling, we can sort of have that encounter ourselves, as we read those books. But that doesn't excuse us, right? We got to get out and have those encounters ourselves, because it really can be transformative. Just to share a little bit of my own journey, and maybe possibly one of the reasons why this is so important to me is because in college, I met a person who was Muslim for the first time. And it was right after 9/11 had happened. There was a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment. There was a lot being said in the news. There were perceptions that I think a lot of people had, probably including myself as well, because of the fear that was being cultivated. Well, I entered into a relationship. I encountered that person became my husband. And it completely transformed, I think, opened my eyes to perceptions that I had, that encounter and that experience of hearing another person's stories and struggles blew my mind. And then that became a challenge, and a good challenge, I think, for my extended family as well, who had never ever met someone who was Muslim before. But it's been a journey for all of us, and a beautiful one, but challenging too. And you have to be willing to be uncomfortable and to be challenged.
And just to share a very quickly a little piece of my story, I somehow made my way into a Catholic worker community not too long after grad school. And most of our work was with men and women and children who were experiencing homelessness and poverty. And I've spent the next 6 years, in some ways living side by side, working. And they became my friends. They became part of my family. And it was extraordinarily enlightening and empowering and transformative for me, because everything I had ever thought about homeless people, poor people, it was exploded by the stories. Just hearing the stories from people who sharing their lives was powerful. Jill, we do have a question here from Nancy. She's asking, is the program Civilize It for individuals, or is it usable inside a parish setting?
Yeah, definitely. So Civilize It is an initiative. It's not a program like the one Jack is describing, where it sounds like you have a robust program from A to Z to do with small groups. That's not what Civilize It is. Civilize It is an initiative that is geared towards individuals, families, and communities, that has materials that can be used both on an individual basis in your prayer time, for example, the examination of conscience, to help you come to a greater understanding of where Christ might be calling you to encounter, dialogue, and approach others in a way that maybe you wouldn't have before, but could also be shared in a community setting. For example, in a bulletin, in a homily, the pastor or a deacon may be making to share that content in a prayer service, right? So there's a lot of different materials. I've even heard that the pledge, because there's a pledge to a better kind of politics, has been shared even with elected officials to say, we want to hold you to the standard to be engaging with civility with other candidates. So it's sort of across the board, hopefully useful.
Wonderful. And Sharon has actually sent us one of her favorite quotes from the Compassion book, which is so good. I am going to read it out loud for everybody because it's just lovely. She's quoted it, and she's also reminded me that the third author was Don McNeil, in addition to George. She says Doug Morris, and I think it was George, but I could be wrong about that, and Henry Nouwen. So here's the quote. Compassion is not the bending toward the underprivileged from a privileged position. It is not a reaching out from on high to those who are less fortunate below. It is not a gesture of sympathy or pity for those who fail to make it in the upward pull. On the contrary, compassion means going directly to those people and places where suffering is most acute and building a home there, finding a place to be and starting to build relationships, I think, if I could paraphrase that. Let's see, Jill, I'm going to look through some of the other comments here and see if there's any other questions. Oh, I just wanted to make this observation. Well, so here's another comment. I can't read the author's name. This just came into the chat. It says, the guest speaker in our Module 3 Just Faith session on racial justice said, instead of going out looking for people of color to encounter, we should change our thinking and demeanor, and a person of color just might find us. Well, so there's another possibility. I was thinking, Jill, the program that we're launching, Want to Talk, that's Leela mentioned earlier and that we saw the video earlier tonight, is crafted really with the assumption that the work we're talking about, the challenge that Pope Francis is issuing here, is not immediately obvious how we do that. I mean, in other words, it takes some skills that, quite frankly, probably a lot of us have under-exercised, or maybe don't even know what the skills are. And I'm thinking to myself about under the category of Christian formation, just what would, catechesis in a Catholic parish, or Christian formation in another denomination in the Christian panorama. When we talk about that, we're really talking about what are the not only what are the belief systems, but what are the skills I need to practice my faith. And I if you don't mind, I just wanted to I think that there's a lovely connection here between the Civilize It project, if you will, and Want to Talk program, because we're really trying to provide the skill sets and some exercises that allow people to do exactly what you've described tonight. So I use this as a little bit of a shameless plug for people who might be interested in how to make this happen in their home faith communities, et cetera, et cetera. So Jill, thank you so much. It was just such a pleasure to have you again tonight. We're so thankful for your willingness to be with us, and I look forward to the next time. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. Wonderful to be with you all.
And if I could invite all of our gathered tonight just to give a silent clap for Jill, and we so appreciate her work and her time with us. I also want to thank you all again for being here. To reiterate something Leela said earlier in the night, she will be sending an email to all of you with the video link to Jill's presentation. Feel free to forward it far and wide. I'm sure Jill would appreciate that. We're glad to see it happen. Also, in that email will be an invitation for you to collaborate with us. Tonight's presentation was free, and we love providing these at no charge so that everybody can join in. But I also like to ask those of you who can to share in our work. And specifically, I invite you to take a look at the link in the email to see how you can support and partner in the work of JustFaith Ministries. Our work is to provide resources that educate, inspire, and change people who then change the world. So, I thought for our closing prayer tonight, we would use a piece of music. It's a kind of a meditation on our conversation tonight, and really kind of a way forward that reiterates some of the themes that we've been talking about. The singer is Peter Mayer, and Leela will include a link to his website in the follow-up email. So Leela, would you mind sharing that with us now?
It's not far to another heart. It's not far to another heart. You can hear it if you listen hard. It's not far. It's not far. It's not far to another's eyes. It's not far to another's eyes. You can see through them if you try. It's not far. It's not far. It's not far to another land. It's not far to another land. If you walk there, then you may understand. It's not far. It's not far. It's not far to you just reach out from where you are. It's not far. It's not far. It's not far. It's not far.
Thanks, Jill, again for your lovely words tonight. Thank you all for being here tonight. God bless and good night.